Welcome to the Making of Man. My name is Matthew Rodriguez, and in this episode, I'm joined by Hugh Hunter, a podcaster who runs the podcast, The Manly Saints Project. In his project, he talks about manly saints from the beginning of the church all the way up until now. He discusses saints, blessed, anyone that's on the process of becoming a canonized saint. The goal of this project for himself personally, and now what he's offering to men everywhere, is to provide us role models that we can look to in order to learn how to become more manly men and more manly saints ourselves. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Take a listen. Welcome, Hugh. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much for the invite.
Yeah. Okay, so I will start by gushing a little bit. I've listened to all of the episodes for the Manly Saints Project, so I appreciate the work that you have done for that. I found it and just binge listened to them all, and I'm just curious in regards to what prompted you to start the project in the first place. You mentioned a couple things throughout some of the episodes, but just as far as what was the initial spark, or what kind of prompted you to start that project?
No, yeah. Well, what prompted me was I became a Catholic. I'm an adult convert. I'm a convert from the Anglican tradition, so I'm a member of the Anglican ordinariate. So, and it always sort of bothered me a little bit that there's a lot of things in the church that are somewhat the things that seem effeminate. This isn't a very good way of putting it. There's a lot of stuff that's effeminate, and I think that it always bothered me when I was an Anglican. When I became a Catholic, I started thinking about it in the context of the saints, and I read accounts of saints, and I thought, like, this is not a real person that's being described. I remember one male saint, and the sort of headline fact that they had about him was he ran puppet shows for the children. I thought, no one talks like this. No one lives like this. I mean, I'm sure that he did run puppet shows, but that's surely not the most interesting fact. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I have a background as a historian. I'm a historian of philosophy by training. And so I thought, surely if I look at the sources, I'll find something different. And so I started looking into the sources. I started looking into Vita's, Vitae, I guess, if you want to be correct about it. So the sort of lives written about a lot of saints in the past, soon after their deaths. And they were just so much more interesting. They're so much richer. There's all this detail. And I thought, well, nobody's telling these stories, and I can do it, so I should do it. And that's sort of what made me think this was an interesting project, maybe worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's kind of...
Yeah. I noticed that a lot of the saints that you cover are maybe off the beaten path of the saints that we might think of. If you think about just mainstream saints in general, or just even narrow it down to mainstream male saints, you do a lot of saints in the early church that I didn't know about, and then a lot of kind of like Anglo saints, but a lot of saints in conflict, I would say. It seems to be a kind of theme kind of throughout. But is there a specific kind of focus on less viewed saints? Is that something that you're kind of trying to bring out, or what's the thought process behind kind of choosing the saints that you do as you're doing the research that you're doing?
So honestly, part of it is very pedestrian. It's just a procedural thing. I've noticed that a lot of people who write a lot run into writer's block or some sort of paralysis because they can't decide between possible subjects to cover. So I thought, how can I avoid this? And what I came up with was every saint that I cover, if you read the Substack or listen to the podcast right when it comes out, is a saint for that coming week, or at least arguably for that coming week. Some kind of one of the feasts will be for that coming week, and so that narrows my scope, and it just makes it easier to choose. So some weeks, there's just an abundance of choices, and some weeks I'm really it really takes a lot of research to find anyone. So part of the reason that I sometimes write about more obscure saints is that, and I think your question had two parts. One is why are there so many obscure saints? That's part of the reason. I mean, another part is I think there's a lot of information about the famous saints out there, and I find it somehow more satisfying to dig into these obscure stories. It's true, a lot of them are military. I'd like to make. I mean, they're not all military. I've got pilgrims, and I have a lot of priests and bishops and things like this. But Aristotle did say that Aristotle thought, most Greeks thought that, the fundamental virtue of a man is andreia, so courage, and that it's most clearly on display in war. Not that it is always on display there. So I think that's it's easy to see manly virtue, I think, in these military saints. But I definitely don't want to be pigeonholed into that.
Yeah. No, and that's fair. And I think you do a good job of drawing forth just all the ways that Christ can call a man to serve him. You mentioned like the pilgrims, like that was a complete vocation that I didn't really know about, where these people would just be poor on the road. And that was the point.
Yeah.
Was to be poor and on the road. And they were a shining testament to the life of Christ, because that's what he did. That's exactly, what he was doing. And so when we think about discernment today, and, it's definitely a big topic, and people tend to view it just between religious or priestly vows and then the married life. It seems that there's a lot of like analysis paralysis that goes on, where people kind of just, they get the topic of discernment, they get the idea, and then they just kind of spin where they're at. But with the saints that you've brought up, to put it in a very blunt way, they kind of just pray about it, they think about it for sure, but then they just kind of send it. They're just like, all right, like I'm gonna go do this thing. Has that impacted the way that you've thought about discernment or making decisions as you've kind of gone through these saints and seen just the complete kind of faith that they have, and just the almost intensity of their drive once they kind of latch on to something?
Yeah, no, it has changed my thinking, and that's I like that question. Like a saint like Saint Benedict Joseph Labre, I covered a few weeks ago now. Yeah, I mean, you're right. They see what they think they're being called to do, and they go for it. And sometimes they're wrong, right? I mean, say, in his case, he was completely wrong. He kept trying to get into a monastery, a specific monastery. He was just sure that's where he was being called. And, it wasn't until he had failed multiple times and realized that the failure was the calling. And in his case, he was being called back to be a pilgrim, and a sort of beggar, a fool for Christ, a kind of another older archetype. A very fascinating guy, but so I think this idea that you're called in a direction and then often you fail, and that's part of the calling was eye-opening to me. There's also a sort of, I have a philosophical thought about this, because I'm afraid I can't resist bringing in that aspect of it. I think the right way to think about ethics is what's called virtue ethics. So we usually think of this as an Aristotelian tradition, and Aristotle's idea is that if you want to figure out what the right thing to do is, don't be like a utilitarian and try to calculate how much pleasure there is on one side or pain on the other. No. The only way to figure out what's good is to find a good man and do what he does. And that's what Aristotle says. And some people find that really unsatisfying because they say, yeah, but like, what if my situation is one that the good man would never be in? I wake up in the gutter next to my, my drugs and, with the police after me. What do I do now? And I think that's where um, the saints, I think, have a lot to teach us because, often you find people in these terrible situations. It's like, what if I have literally sold my soul to Satan? Well, we've got a saint for that, right? Check out Saint Bartolo Longo. Um, or what if I think I'm being called to be a beggar, or what if I'm 60 years old and I'm married to the I have the trophy wife, and I think my life is going great, and then I come home, my wife is with another man. I suddenly realize these are not my children. I suddenly realize my life is a huge joke and I'm an old man. What do I do? Well, St. Paul the Simple was in this very situation, and he becomes one of the most inspiring exorcists and saints I've encountered. So um, I think in terms of the one question is for people is what moment of your life are you in, and how do you follow a vocation in that moment? And I think the saints can help with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that there's literally a book, The Lives of the Saints, which I've read parts of, and I'm sure this podcast would remind me of that as well. But honestly, it reminds me a lot about I have it on my shelf over here of Plutarch, where he does the lives, and he goes through with kind of the same idea of obviously for a different population, but the virtue ethics of here's a Greek and here's a Roman, and here's what I like and dislike about the way that they live their lives, and not necessarily just instruction by objective or by principle, but instruction by example, and saying, hey. So no, I think it's really cool to be able to have the ability to look at the saints kind of in a fairly, I would say, accessible way. The podcasts are around 15 to 30 minutes long. And get a good sense of all the lives that you can lead to grow closer to Christ.
I to jump in, I mean, that's a great example. Plutarch is how we used to do history, right? All right, to put in a plug for this way, history doesn't have to be this boring thing. Historians don't have to write for other historians. You can write like Plutarch did, and just write stuff that a human being who wasn't being paid to read it might actually want to read. So I think that's how history should be done anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and it's very organic. It's very human, and so I think that makes it very approachable. When it's not just all dates and numbers and battles and like all this stuff, but when there's little tiny snippets that you can kind of reach onto, like there is the example that you use a couple times of Saint Basil praying to Saint Mercurius with Justinian when he goes to Persia.
Yeah.
What a interesting, and I guess for listeners, if they don't know that story, Saint Basil the Great is praying to an icon of Saint Mercurius when the Emperor Justinian the Julian the Apostate?
It is Julian, yeah.
Julian, thank you.
Yeah.
Julian the Apostate goes to try and conquer Persia, which would have been a fantastic political move, would have allowed him to get a lot more political capital behind paganism.
Yeah.
And St. Basil the Great obviously is an opponent of this. He's praying to St. Mercurius, comes to look at the icon one day. St. Mercurius is gone from the icon, has disappeared from the page. And then a little while later returns with the tip of his spear is red, where before it had been not, it had been gold or whatever the iconographer had made it. And Julian had been killed by a random spear throw that no one took credit for. And so that's like that little anecdote, and just kind of little anecdotes like that, I think help make it seem more human in a way of, I have icons, like I can, I can pray to icons, like I can do these things. And they help it seem less just absolutely out of the ordinary when we talk about miracles. And when you look at it kind of through this almost history of miracles, of just miracles are happening all over the place and people are getting healed and all this stuff, it helps make it seem a little bit more normalized and like, oh, like, okay,
Yeah.
the stuff that Christ was doing is still in the world. And for that example, I'll bring up, so and so and go through it there. So I think that's a really cool way to walk through time, just through the lives of different people who are human just like us.
No, I think you're right. Well, and if it's been that way for me personally, learning. I mean, I certainly didn't know a lot of these stories before I started researching them, and there is a sense of re-enchantment, and a lot of these miracles are they're shocking, but I mean, as you say, miracles do occur quite regularly, and I don't mean like the miracle of a baby's smile. I mean, like incorruptible saints or Eucharistic miracles, or there was the I want to say Zitun, I think that's how you pronounce it. The apparition of the Virgin Mary, seen by like 250,000 people. I mean, these things. I sometimes when I'm writing this, I feel as though I'm in a bit of a dialogue with secular historians. I sort of know what they would say. Well, they would say, look, yeah, people used to believe these things in the past, but modern science would refute it. But what I've noticed is that that there's kind of I guess a cycle of supposed refutation of these miracles. So what happens is that the miracle comes along, the scientists of the day view it and are baffled. Like this happens with every Eucharistic miracle. They test it. I think they've DNA tested them and stuff like this, and they say, "Wow, this sure looks like what it is supposed to be." But then 10 years pass, and the scientists of 10 years later say, "Oh no! If only they had our methods, they would have easily debunked the supposed miracle." So the default assumption becomes again, "Oh no, science would have debunked it if only we had been there." And then it happens again and again. It happened, famously in the time of the philosopher René Descartes. There was a Eucharistic miracle tested by all the scientists of the day. But of course, we now think, well, what does a 17th century scientist even know?
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think as well, just the lives of the people that you bring up are almost a refutation of some of the arguments against, Catholicism, that even for someone who is not as interested in philosophy or even theology, just isn't isn't interested in apologetics. I think that there's a much simpler refutation, a much simpler argument that you can use that honestly I think should just be used more. I think a lot of people, even those that do like apologetics, kind of skip this argument of like, I want my life to be like the people that are the saints more so than the people that aren't.
Yeah.
Like, I just think that they live more fascinating lives, more interesting lives. They seem to be more fulfilled. You look at the people that are on top of the world and they usually don't come to a good end. Like it doesn't normally happen. And then you get, I forget the saint who had the hospital, Saint John of the hospital. Yeah. Who was just always known for laughing. Like he was a poor person and he did what he could in the name of Christ, and he seemed to enjoy himself till his end. And so I think that that's a powerful refutation of just in this world of seemingly infinite choices, and infinite information. Like we get to see so much. We get to see how celebrities live their lives, and we get to be like, actually, that doesn't seem so fun. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. And well, one thing I've been trying to draw attention to is the these are men who have they're men who have projects, or these are lives that have meaning. I mean, obviously they have a kind of transcendent meaning, but Saint John of God is a good example. Sometimes a way of presenting the saints that I take issue with, right? I say, well, Saint John of God, he was just out there helping people. He built this hospital. It was for everybody. You had people had mental problems alongside people who are just poor, who just had a bad run of bad luck or whatever. Um, and the presentation is often it's presented as though being a saint is just about embracing everything that is not functioning correctly. It's just surrounding yourself with dysfunction. And I think it's important to say no. I mean, of course, being a saint is it's about redeeming dysfunction. But Saint John of God wasn't just sort of creating a permanent dependency class. On the contrary, right? He's out there saying, you're down on your luck. Good. I will go bother some rich guy to give you a job tomorrow. I'm going to get you back on your feet. You're single. No problem. I know a bunch of eligible young women. Let's pair you up. Let's get you married. Let's get you employed and get you back on your feet. So there's sort of practicality to these lives that I think I think it's attractive to men, and uh, it's a story I think that needs to be told, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually a different viewpoint than I had on some of the lives, where I noticed just in saints in general, a lot of saints, and maybe even more so like the greatest of saints, tend to isolate themselves or seem to isolate themselves kind of from the human realm, the temporal realm. There's a lot of people, and we know in the spiritual world that's not true. They're praying for us. They're interceding for us.
Right.
I don't mean to make any connotation that they're completely abandoning kind of the human element. But there's a lot of people that, they were in the army and then they throw down their arms in front of the emperor and they say, like, I'm no longer doing this, then they leave. Or they kind of leave a promising, St. Francis, right, who leaves a promising career and wealthy parents to go and to become the saint that he was called to become.
Yeah.
You have a lot of people that seem to abandon the maybe more natural connections in order to show the supernatural. And in today's day and age, from my experiences with young men, there's already so much distance between them and other people, where they might work from home, so they're not around their coworkers, and they might try and date on apps, so they're not really meeting people in person. They're trying to meet people digitally, and they're zooming with friends, or they're just not as embedded as you would be if you almost didn't have the ability to reach out digitally. And so this is a very open-ended question, but it's my understanding that, or my thought, that in today's day and age, the greatest saints will be those that actually fulfill the human connections the best, right? That will become like just straight up the best fathers, right? That will become, the best community members and council members, and we can think of mayors, and just these things that they're deeply embedded in the human element. And so I would love to see your thoughts as you've kind of gone through and seen some of these themes. Does that maybe seem to line up, or is there maybe cause for more monastic kind of examples and stuff like that that can bring people back to what it means to be a part of the church?
Oh, well. Boy, that last part of the question. I mean, surely it's true, right? Surely it's always true that we need more, monks, and we need everything, right? We need monks and friars, and we need holy fools. We need all these roles to sort of call us back, I think, in different ways and pray for us. But I think that is a really good point about embeddedness being important. And I was, you might think this is there's a difference of perspective, and I think as Catholics we're often we often have trouble looking at ourselves as embedded, and we have trouble looking at Catholicism as embedded. And my pet theory is that this is because we're Roman Catholics, and rather than Ukrainian Rite or something like that. I mean, there are all these other rites, churches within the church, and I suspect if you're in them, it's probably easier to see yourself as embedded in a particular community. And I think, you know, it's uh, you might think of it like a, you know, if you have children, you know, let's say you have a few children, you can understand that there's a way of looking at your life. Maybe the state, you know, takes this view and it says all we really care about is that, you know, Matthew has two children, and if, you know, something happened to one of your children, horrible thought, then, you know, from the state's point of view, it's like, well, whatever, just adopt another child. All we care is that you're at the number two. But of course, and that's a reasonable thing to say from the point of view of a statistician in the state. There really is a point of view on your life in which it doesn't matter which child you have as long as you have a couple of them. But of
Mm-hmm.
course, from within your life, nothing matters more than that. Than um, that you have those specific children. Um, and I think that we kind of, I think the maybe the what it is to be a human being is to be able to perceive ourselves at these two levels, like to see ourselves from this detached point of view. You know, philosophers call this sometimes from the point of view of the universe, sub specie aeternitatis. Not really the translation, but that's how you say it in Latin. And I think, you know, it if there's a critique, or if there's a gentle criticism to be made of some of our leaders in the church, it's that they often seem to default into this view from the point of view of the universe, as though, well, it doesn't really matter as long as we've got, you know, people in the seats, people in the pews. You know, one Catholic is as good as another. So I think, what I'm trying to say is I agree with your basic intuition that one Catholic is not always as good as another. Community matters, and we need to care more about our communities. And you know, that's true within the church. And I think you do see that in the lives of some saints. I mean, of course, you're right. Some saints leave their homes, but you know, um, you have a saint like Saint Demetrius, who was the who sort of became a protector of like one specific city, Thessalonica. And they're just these amazing stories, you know, where Thessalonica gets attacked and there's this guy on the top of the battlements tossing down, I forget what barbarian group it was that attacked. And, you know, everyone thinks this is Saint Demetrius. You know, he cares about this specific city. You know, Saint Severin, I covered more recently, got this very strange call to a specific Roman province. And he, you know, he helped everybody, but he was there specifically to help them. And of course, you know, I think more, you know, within families, you have people, saints like Saint Louis or Saint Ferdinand III of Spain. You know, these are fathers. They devote a lot of their effort to their families and offering their sons rules for life. So I think that, all this to say, it was a long-winded answer, but I think that within the stories of the saints, you can find that embeddedness, and in a way, it's a kind of delusion that we have today, that we have to see ourselves from you know, the 30,000-foot view. But no, like our point of view as embedded individuals with families and you know, cultures and nations. I mean, these are valid points of view. I think saints speak to that. Um,
Yeah. No, and I think that's good to keep in mind.
yeah.
And also just the idea of, at the end of the day, it's just whatever Christ asks us to do, you know?
Yeah.
Which I sometimes kind of just lose track of, where it's trying to fill my embeddedness, and it's like, well, that kind of is second rate to whatever he wants.
Yeah.
With the idea of saints, kind of pulling back and thinking about just saints broadly speaking, what kind of benefit have you found, maybe, or do you think there could be, in drawing more attention to patron saints? Because I'm also a convert, and so I thought that idea was really, really cool. Of, you get to come in, and there's the idea, you know, it seems like we choose them, but there's the idea that they actually choose us through some means to draw our attention to them. And then it seems like you're just kind of in this even smaller Catholic family within the Catholic Church of, my patron saint is Saint Philip Neri, and so whenever I see anybody else that's also a client of Saint Philip Neri, I do feel a connection a connection there. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that as far as patron saints and how maybe that can help with this embeddedness discussion.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting? Yeah, I mean, it does. I think it's the kind of thing that you sort of wish had been chosen for you, or chosen perhaps by Providence. Um, uh, I mean, I think it used to be the case that, I mean, of course, Catholic children are supposed to have a saint's name. But if you don't have a saint's name, it used to be the case that you got assigned one at baptism. And often it would be a very strange saint, to underscore the point that children should have proper saints' names.
Yeah.
But still, it seems like it would be. I feel in a way as though I've missed out by not growing up with a patron saint. But on the other hand, there is some advantage to having chosen one. I mean, it gave me the opportunity to choose a saint who had, or perhaps be chosen by the saint who had, who seemed to me to have similar, I guess, problems might be too, maybe a little strong in this case, but a similar disposition with similar, potential negatives. In my case, that was Saint Jerome, who is a very combative, disputive kind of guy, and you see it in his writings. He's always he loves blasting people. He likes nothing better than to be in an argument. At one point, he tells Saint Augustine, you might be younger than me, but you should reread. I think it's the Odyssey, because two guys box, and the old guy knocks out the young guy. So don't forget that.
Nice.
He's a sympathetic character to me, and of course, for Saint Jerome, a lot of his life was figuring out how to achieve sanctity with that kind of a character and those dispositions, and pointing them in the right direction. So, I think that I've benefited very greatly from that patronage. Yeah, and I mean, I think if you don't have a patron saint, that's too bad. It's sad. But, if you read the lives of the saints, I think you'll find you very soon do have one. And, it is a, you kind of know when you've got there. So I think that speaks to the idea that you're not really doing the choosing. I guess you're initiating the search, but you're not doing the choosing. I guess, yeah. It's comforting in a way to think that when I was a Protestant, the spiritual world seemed a lot smaller to me than it does now. I mean, there are so many. There are thousands and thousands of saints. We don't know the names of all of the saints. You could easily find saints that are completely, or that are very obscure. And to think that all of these people are, as it were, looking for clients. You can. It's exciting to think there are probably saints that where nobody is asking for them to pray for them, right? You could be the only person that this saint is praying for. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe we do get kind of a different view of it because we choose them as confirmation saints. But I think that at least in my experience, it almost helps force the issue of saints being a role model that you can follow. Yeah. Where if you specifically have one that's either given to you or that you kind of choose, or that chooses you, whenever you're thinking about what should I be doing with my life, or what's a good role model to follow that maybe lived closer to me time wise than Christ did, it's a natural place to go to your patron saint.
Yeah.
And I mean, Saint Philip Neri for me is one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, where he in Rome, when Rome was not doing well. Let's put it that way. He noticed that, and economically and spiritually, he noticed that there are a lot of groups of young men that just didn't have any work, and he knew a thing or two, and he knew that groups of young men that don't have anything to do for work very quickly became groups of young men that stole or just got into mischief. And so he'd go around and he would kind of find things for them to do, and created a pilgrimage for them and stuff like that. And so that was inspirational for me when I was also looking around today. And I have been one of those men that didn't really know what to do. And thankfully I found the Catholic Church, but there are a lot of people in the church and outside of it that are kind of doing what seems to be recommended and aren't having a good time doing that. So I think it's a very powerful thing to be able to look at a saint in particular who you have a specific relationship with, and then whether or not your life kind of fits theirs, that doesn't need to happen, but it just kind of can jog ideas or inspire different actions. I want to also touch base on something that you brought up, which I thought was interesting, which you had coined the Mediterranean problem. And I don't know if that's a universal term or if you've invented that. But I thought it was an interesting kind of concept, and it kind of deals with some of the regional or geographic differences between how we think through kind of spiritual language. And I was thinking about this earlier when you brought up the Roman Catholic Church versus the Ukrainian kind of rite and stuff like that, and how the Roman Catholic Church, it's universal, which can be good, but also there are maybe some idiosyncrasies within some of that universality that need addressing. And so I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about that thought.
Yeah, no, that I would be happy to. I hope gently for Mediterranean listeners. Look, the thought is just that as you say, the Roman Church used to be sort of really, if we think, this is my pet theory, but isn't it true that really what the Roman Church is the Holy Roman Empire? I mean, if you think about it, right? Kind of, it's that big chunk of Europe, not too far east, kind of annexes North America and South America. That's the Holy Roman Empire. And so, but then during the Reformation, what happened is that a lot of the northern countries were the ones that became Protestant. So, England, Germany, to a large extent, and the Scandinavian countries. So my theory is that a kind of language has been developed in the way the church talks to itself that is more typical of Mediterranean countries like Italy or Spain or France. And I was thinking, can I substantiate this? So I went and looked up a novena for the Saints Jacinta and Francisco Marto, the shepherds, and here are just some words out of the novena, and I just want to read these if I might. Little shepherds, fondling your furry white lambs, pray for us. Little shepherds with your clear, innocent gaze, pray for us. Little shepherds with your angelic smile, pray for us. Now look, these are nice sentiments, but this is not how a man talks, right? Or at least it's not how a Anglo or Northern man like me talks. It's foreign to our nature. We don't talk about furry white lambs. And I thought, maybe what's going on here is that in Italian or French, or I don't read Italian or Spanish. I do speak French, and it's certainly a more emotionally loaded language. And you can say these sorts of things. And indeed, you think in the language you speak in. So you can think this in these languages and cultures, but it's weird for us. And so I think that part of one of the accidental feminizing influences in the church is just the language we speak. And I do think it would behoove influential Catholics to think about this, right? If you're going to start talking about fondling your furry white lambs, I mean, I, would your dad say that? And if not, maybe we don't. we we revise that.
Yeah.
And by way of contrast, I was thinking, I wanted to compare. Here is, I think, a manly formulation from one of the very first saints or oh no, that's not true. It's one of the very first saints I encountered, but not the first I covered. But Saint Gordius, who was this Roman centurion, he found himself in this weird situation. He sort of got pushed out of the army because he was a Christian, went and became a hermit, and then he heard that the governor of the town where he had been had this actually very clever plan to use a sort of religiously loaded uh, games to bring everybody back to paganism and sort of make everybody participate in what was essentially a kind of sacrifice, because the ancient games were sort of sacrifices. Anyway, Gordius realized he could ruin this whole plan at the expense of his own life. So he went, sacrificed himself. He knew exactly how to talk to make the governor really angry. The governor completely played into his hands, ritually defiled himself, which meant everything had to start again, which ruined the game. So it was a very clever plan. But the life of Saint Gordius records his sort of sayings. So here's what he said. This is how I think men should talk, and I think the Catholic Church should talk to men. He said, "Death comes to all men. Since we have to die, let us, through our death, win life. Make what is necessary voluntary. Trade what is earthly for what is heavenly." I mean, at least I hear that, and I think, if you could convince a young man of that, your work is 90% done.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Mediterranean problem as I see it. I think
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, and thank you for fleshing that out. And I think that there's actually multiple kind of different dimensions that I've seen kind of that tension beyond. Because I think in a lot of ways, whether we are specifically engaged in it as men, or just kind of it's the culture that we're swimming in, there is definitely a tension right now of what it means to be masculine, and there are a lot of people that see masculinity as basically being effeminate, right? That masculinity has been the cause of all the problems of the past, and so we need to stop that. And then there's others on the opposite side, which basically, by the very fact that they're standing up against that narrative, they are men who are willing to stand up against narratives, which can be inspiring, but they tend to be dramatically on the opposite side of, men are men because we can kind of rule by strength and by our iron will.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's too big of a stretch to say that I think all men are basically battered between those two ideologies, again, whether they know it or not, of right now. And so, yeah, I think that, there is an interesting way that the Catholic Church can kind of affirm things from both, and also not
Yeah.
from both, that I think does kind of, it's a matter of what strategy do we use for the specific moment, or kind of for who we're talking to, where many men can be very very gentle. And there's a famous picture of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux kind of hugging Christ as Christ is on the cross, and a lot of people look at that and they're almost affronted by how compassionate and loving it is. And then also, like, as you say, Saint Joseph, terror of demons, I don't think has ever been more popular than he is right now, because a lot of young men are like, that's what I want. Like, I want the terror, right? I want the fighter that's willing to fight for me.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. It's like, isn't it like so many things where when you fail in your duty, there's a kind of a scourge, or well, this is sort of biblical trope, right? That people fail to do what they ought to do, and God sends a scourge. But but I think a scourge is usually a kind of, it's a funhouse mirror that shows what you should have been doing. And I think that we often find that in the church today, that we you're right, we lack in masculinity. I mean, it's not just a problem in the church, it's a problem across, I would say, Western culture. And then we have these, distorted versions of masculinity, and people like, well, like Andrew Tate famously, infamously, I suppose, where you can see that there's something correct about this, but it's not quite right. But it is a rebuke to people who fall far short of someone like Tate as well. And yeah, I think especially as Catholics, where we have, it's not unreasonable if you go into a Catholic church and you encounter you know uh, something that when you go into my church, you see a gigantic Divine Mercy picture, and it says, "Jesus, I trust in you." That's fair. And then underneath it says, "I don't need to understand." And every time I see it, I think, no, no, don't say this. I do need to understand, and most men do, and it's a very good and masculine instinct to want to understand. So I think it behooves us, as the people who've noticed this problem, to try to articulate. I mean, as you're doing, what exactly is a Catholic man? How is it not Andrew Tate, and it's not some sad effeminate figure either. It's something you could be proud of, and if your daughter was going to marry one, you'd think, "Oh, good," rather than, "Oh no."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that especially when it comes to like sanctity, and this has been my experience, and I've shared this with other people, and they seem to agree that sanctity seems it seems weak before you try it.
Yeah.
Right? Like the person who's prayed the rosary, I don't know why I always come back to this example, but I find it very heroic. The person who's like 80 and has prayed the rosary every day for like 40 plus years, that's incredible. Like that is a wild record. And they're probably doing more than that. But even if we just focused on that, to have the consistency, the perseverance, the dedication to do something like that, yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely a level of manliness that maybe isn't as bombastic as what we've seen in some other examples, but is a way that by looking at the saints and what they do, even focusing on the person that we brought up before, Saint John of God, it's not easy to go to a rich person and ask for money.
Yeah.
Like it's not easy to take on the cares of others and say, yeah, I am going to get you a job, or I am going to try and find you a wife. And those things might not be seen as super courageous or in the same lens. But I mean, honestly, we could also go to like martyrdom. Like, I don't think anyone could question the courage that it takes to be a martyr. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that there are ways that the saints can be an example of threading that needle between, being affectionate, being caring, being loving, but not bending the knee to ideologies or to people that they don't want to. They're fine being Gordius that you mentioned, and okay, take my life, that's fine, but I've just saved the souls of however many people are in this stadium, and made a fool of the prefect or whoever it was in the attempt. Yeah. So yeah, I think that experientially there's a lot of manly things in sanctity that maybe can be missed if you're just looking at it kind of on paper.
No, I think that's right. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the sort of archetype that we're looking for, in a way. I mean, I think often, we I don't say overcomplicate, but I guess our culture and our moment makes it seem like it's some unnatural thing for a man to be simultaneously gentle and kind when it's appropriate, and also ferocious when that's appropriate. But of course, I mean, that's the exact trait we're looking for in fathers. It's something, Plato talks about that as a trait of soldiers. That he says soldiers should be like. He says, look, you see this in your guard dog, right? Your guard dog is super nice to the family,
Mm.
and yet ferocious to anybody trying to sneak onto your property. I mean, but I think Plato could have generalized it. This is just what it is to be any kind of animal that's responsible for something. It's what it is to be a human animal, specifically a father who is responsible for a family. So I think the kind of this double-sided character of kindness and strength is that's just what it is to be. It's what it is to be a man. To be a man is to be, at least in principle, ready to be a father. And well, and of course that God gives us fatherhood as a kind of mirror of what He is. So it's also a link, I think, to the transcendent as well. So yeah, I I guess I think as Catholics we should, as any sensible person should say no, like this is what men are supposed to be, and
Hmm.
it's our culture that's weird and disordered if it suggests this is complicated or strange or unusual at all. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think that um, this project that you're working on does a good job of bringing forward like the medieval man, who I think has been in the shadows for quite some time. There was another book that I listened to from Tom Holland called
Oh
Dominion.
yeah.
I don't know if you've gotten a chance to take a look at that, but he did a really really good job, kind of just going through time, basically from before Christ all the way to now. And a connection that I'd never really made before is you basically had the Reformation and the Enlightenment both basically chunking out the medieval ages, trying to dispose of them, and claiming legitimacy and legacy from the eras that came before, right? So for the Protestants, it was the very, very early church. For the Enlightenment, it was basically the Greeks and the Romans.
Yeah.
But basically, anyone from the very early church to Martin Luther in both camps was tossed out. And we have this in our vernacular of I want to be a Renaissance man, or I want to kind of like do these things. And in my viewing of Catholic projects that relate to Catholic men, there's a lot of discussion on the medieval times and medieval men, and bringing forth some of that thought, and like you're saying, making it not super complicated, making it more understandable, making those people more human, that it's not just the jester or the bloodthirsty crusader knight. Like there are people in between, that maybe we actually can look to as examples and role models. And I'm curious to see kind of where that goes, because again, I think the chivalric element embodies maybe some of the ideas that you're bringing up of, they were out to go and slay dragons, and then they were out to come back and be cordial at dinner,
Yeah.
and to have manners. And so, yeah, I am very curious to see what continues to happen in this kind of Catholic medieval thought as more light gets brought to examples and lifestyles and just the time in general.
That's yeah. Well, I'm obviously a very big fan of the Middle Ages. I think that it's an underrated period. And as you say, I mean, I remember it kind of blew my mind the first time I learned that, or when I learned that enlightenment isn't a descriptive term that we use of a period. No, that's the term they used for themselves. I mean, can you imagine uh, the hubris of it? I should say too, the philosopher I most worked on was an Enlightenment scholar, but he would have shared my critique. He much preferred the Middle Ages too, in many ways. Um, I think one thing that I guess is worth pointing out. Whenever someone starts talking about the topic of man in the church, a name that often that comes up is Leon Pottles. He wrote a book called The Church Impotent, and it, I think for a lot of people, it was the first time they heard their grievances articulated. And it's a great book. It's free on his website. I recommend it very much. Some of the chapters are honestly hard reading because he just sort of itemizes things in the church that turn men off. But what's interesting about his thesis is that you think this is going to be about like something that happened in the 80s or maybe even the 30s, the 1930s.
Mm.
But his claim is actually that it's been happening for the past 8 centuries, and that he blames this slow process on, well, he blames a bunch of things. He blames scholastic philosophy, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, female mysticism. Whether that's true or not, I think it's at least an interesting observation that the Orthodox leave the church, or we part ways, perhaps. Let's be unified again. I think they're great. But anyway, that happens about 900 years ago, but the Protestant Reformation is only about 500 years ago. So the stereotype, I guess, of the unmanly Christian applies to Protestants, but not to Orthodox. And I think that's a very, very strong point in favor of Pottle's thesis that for a very long time, we've been, I guess, behaving in ways, pretty much since the end of the Middle Ages, we've been doing things that drive men out of the church. And he's gone through historical documents to just look at like who was in church in the 16th century. And it turns out, it's more women than men. For a very long time, the demographics of the church have been this way. And of course, as he points out, priests understandably don't want to lose the audience that they have, and so they often this becomes a sort of self-fulfilling. Well, that's a mixed metaphor. It's a bad cycle where priests double down on things that men find weird, and then even more men leave. And I think we can see that in the it's a criticism I make in love, right? But we see that in the church of today. That's so often, if you think about for whom is it optimized, it's not just for women. I don't want to talk about it, but it's for grandmothers, because it's been so alienating that you have whole generations that often aren't even in the church. And so we're really speaking to the grandmothers of 2 generations who are absent. So I think Pottles he's written another book on it. He does seem to see this as the tragic end of a very old process. So one reason, to reach back to the Middle Ages, it's kind of like what Protestants do when they reach back to the early. It's not really what they imagine the early church was like. This fictional early church. Well, I think you reach back into the Middle Ages to say, well, what were things like before these things started going wrong? And one thing that you see actually is a lot more focus on patron saints. All kinds of saints have their own patrons. You do obviously have Mariology and a lot of veneration of the Blessed Virgin Mary, but you don't have. It's not sort of the default in the same way, right? You just hear a lot more about patron saints than you would from Catholics today. So it's kind of a neat. I guess that's one reason I'm always reaching back to the Middle Ages. Plus, honestly, sometimes it's just easier to tell older stories. Easier in the sense that the sources for them are so great. Some of the stories one can find are so delightful. Hopefully the enthusiasm comes through. It's just great stuff. You read about pilgrims and one pilgrim who, if you read accounts of the time, their pilgrims were all worried about this fish that would with that kind of awl on its nose, and it would come up to a boat and drill a hole in the boat. And the only way you had to watch, they thought you had to watch for it, and if it came, you had to get in a staring contest, and if you could outstare it, it would let you pass. But if you failed, it would jump up and grab you and pull you in. So it's such a vivid,
Mm-hmm.
fun world.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even to that point, I mean, yeah, there's a bunch of thoughts that kind of stem from what you just said, but even to that point, and the point you made earlier in this conversation about some sense of re-enchanting the world, and as I mean, it's being documented as we speak, and I think I can say this just as like a fact, like as paganism reemerges, whether it's simply culturally or like legitimate pagan practices kind of coming back. My understanding of that is it's an attempt to re-enchant the world, right? It's an attempt to find spirits in the trees, or to kind of like do these things, because that maybe in some senses actually aligns with our experience more than just, every tree is just wood, and we can chop it down and analyze it, and we can do whatever, and we know all the fish in the sea and like all this stuff. And when you hear stories from the medieval ages who were Christian, right? They did have the Christianity root, and then also had these, very interesting stories about, I don't know if they were seeing narwhals or what they were seeing that were drilling holes in the boats, but like there's nothing that makes Christianity and that type of enchantment of the world incompatible with each other. It can't go against Christ, but there's a lot that you can still kind of have in a mystical or a mythical kind of landscape.
No, I agree. I mean, it's an very old Christian idea that, the world. Yeah. So the saints are one way of re-enchanting the world. Right? These wonderful, excellent role models that you can also ask to pray for you. You can dig into their lives. They're human. They made mistakes too, and you can see how they recovered. I think that's a part of the enchantment, or re-enchantment. I think this odd Enlightenment idea. I don't even know how many people really believe this in the Enlightenment. I think it's just one of these ideas that sort of filtered down into pop culture and became much more dangerous. But this idea of the sort of dead, universe where a tree is just a tree. Christians don't have to think that. And I think that one problem with this idea is it's just not very fertile in terms of, or fruitful is the word I'm looking for, in philosophical terms either, right? I mean, this notion that like we can explain the entire world through matter in motion is really a promissory note in philosophical terms, and it keeps not. It hasn't been cashed out, and it can't be cashed out, and so you do see. I guess this is an aspect of what you're describing as repaganization. I mean, you see this in the discipline that I studied, philosophy, where you'll have people who really don't want to be Christians. They don't want to go back to what their grandparents believed. So they say, well, I don't think that there's a God exactly, but I think maybe the universe is aware. I mean, I think what they're saying is the Enlightenment picture has just failed to account for our experiences. So we need some picture based on some kind of mind-like thing. So I think there's this just failure of the paradigm of a godless universe, and I think everybody's trying to position themselves. As to, is it pagan? I mean, I know a lot of people have been saying that. I'm not. I mean, I have to admit, I see less evidence of paganism in the sense. I mean, certainly there are pagan religions that are, real, that are a problem. Like, African witchcraft is a huge problem in the UK now, and around the world. The Santa Muerte stuff out of Mexico is
Hmm.
really evil, bad stuff. Um, how many people actually worship Zeus or Odin? I think even among self-described pagans, a lot of these people, um, back away from the literal interpretation. But what
Hmm.
strikes me as more troubling, I have to say, is, I mean, this does make me sound like a conspiracy theorist, but is sort of outright Satanism. I mean, you can
Mm.
destroy a statue of Saint Junipero Serra, and it's no big deal. But if you smash that idol of Baphomet in Iowa, you're facing prison time. I mean, I feel like I'm running out of euphemisms to describe what is the state where you can't destroy a statue of the devil. Uh,
Yeah.
um, so I sometimes wonder
Mm.
if paganism is quite the thing, or if it's some kind of more, uh, maybe it starts as ironic, but um, I think the devil
Hmm.
can make use of that as well. Um,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and yeah, if you're like, I think that there is some optimism in the sense that if you are no longer completely considering yourself atheistic or just not looking and considering yourself agnostic, if you actually are looking for a divinity, I have some optimism that great, here's ours, you can take this, but also like you're saying, if you open yourself up to the powers that be, there are many, yeah, Satan can make use of that. I guess I'll just put
yeah,
it in that term. Um, there are other voices that can respond.
yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, and not to get too, I don't know, down this uh, garden path, perhaps, but I mean, um, it's you do we haven't, for a very long time, we haven't lived in a world that isn't sort of predominantly Christian, and you do hear
Hmm.
disturbing, to me, things if you look at what exorcists say about how their jobs
Hmm.
have changed, both in the number of problems they're facing, but also in the amount of time it takes to solve them, which it seems has gone up. Um, that's disturbing. It suggests that there is some kind of shift in our world. And
Hmm.
uh, yeah, I mean, Christians do really well playing defense, so I'm not worried. Well, I've never worried for the church as God's church, but I think it might not be so great, so fun for us.
Hmm.
It might be we live in interesting times. Um,
Yes. Well, and with that kind of wrapping together the saints and this kind of the unknown that's out there, oftentimes is categorized as a dragon. And one of the saints that you've covered that I really appreciated your kind of note on was Saint
mm,
George, right? Saint George, the saint who fights the dragon, um, who you kind of mentioned. We for his popularity, we seem to have a surprisingly scant amount of actual
yeah.
details, right? Like we just don't really have a lot of information on him, and so you went into this thought of, well, then why is he so popular, right? Like why is he the patron saint of England? Like
Yeah.
he's a big player. And your takeaway was the fact that like maybe it's just kind of an aspect of sanctity that any man can find solidarity in, right? Like no matter kind of what problem they're going through, that is in a sense their dragon.
Mm,
And they, by the example of this saint, they can also get on their charger and they can have their lance and they can kill this dragon. um and so I really appreciated you kind of drawing that out because yeah, I mean, Saint George, he's everywhere. When you look at art and stuff like that. And maybe that's a hopeful note for our times that no matter what kind of rises from the depths, we all, in a way, can embody that aspect of Saint George and through Christ can conquer.
yeah. Oh well, I'm glad you enjoy. I mean, I can't remember if I put this in the if this was in the St. George story or not. My mother is a painter, and I remember going to an art gallery with her, and there was a picture of St. George, and this tiny little dragon sort of coiled around his feet, and I remember while I was a little boy, and I said, "Well, this isn't even a dragon. It should be huge and fire breathing and exciting." And my mom said, "No, it's a very small dragon." I said, "Well, you could just step on its head." And she said, "Or it could just slither right down his throat and become him." And I thought, "Oh, wow, that is kind of a scary. That is another kind of dragon." And I think we do see that in the depictions of Saint George, that there are all these, even in the paintings, right? There are all these different forms of the dragon. It's also the seductive thing, and the big thing, and the small thing. Yeah.
Yeah. We are coming to the end of time, but I have kind of two other things that I would love to ask. The first one is I want to respect any preparation that you kind of put in, and so if there's a question that I didn't ask that you were looking to talk about, I want to give us time to be able to discuss that, or notes that you had that you wanted to bring into the conversation. I'd be curious if there's anything like that.
Let me just see if I there's anything I think maybe I think it might be worth I think it might be worth saying something about I guess I'm not sure how to fit this in, but one of the things I wanted to bring up, at least, is that in working on the saints, I'm often struck by we're trying to model ourselves on the saints, and one of the saints that really I don't know, struck me in an interesting way was Saint Gregory or Blessed Gregory Lopez, who lived in Mexico. There's some evidence that he was a Spanish prince. That's kind of cool. Maybe he was, but his practice struck me as so bizarre when I first read about it, and then the more I thought about it, the more it affected me. Was he would say with every intake, every time he took a breath or expelled a breath, he would say, "Thy will be done." And he once said something like, sometimes I wake up and I will take half a breath before I say my first one, but then I'm back on the routine.
Solid from then on.
Solid from there. It's first I thought, well, what a weird thing to do, and then I thought, but isn't that, of course, we say to Christ, "I will be done," but of course Jesus, God the Son says to God the Father, "Thy will be done," and so this is we're modeling Jesus, who is modeling a human life for us, and I think when I encountered Blessed Lopez, and I thought, this, imagine forming your life around these few words, and then I thought, no, but this really is the core of what it is to be a saint, is to say to Christ, "Thy will be done." So yeah, I guess I kind of didn't work that in. I thought, I should say something about that. That's my only.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, I think that we can maybe, again, overcomplicate kind of what it takes to be a saint. When at the end of the day, that's it. Like, if you are going through, and I mean, truly for like heroic sanctity, it probably would need to be every breath or close to it, that is your thought process. Right. But at least to get you on the right track every morning, wake up and say, okay, whatever your will is, let that be done. So no, I mean, I think that's a great point to bring up. The last thing that the last question that I ask every guest, it doesn't have to be related to this topic, the topic of saints, but I ask guests for what they think what is their top recommendation to Catholic men today. It can be related to saints if obviously that's where you devote a lot of your thinking, but
Yeah.
just in general, what would be your top recommendation to any man that's listening to this?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think my top recommendation would be, to think of, well, this is outside of my area of focus here, but since you ask, I think my top recommendation would be to think of faith the same way we think of practical applied things like fitness. I know that if I ever want to get more on my bench press, I've got to be doing it every day, or not every. Well, actually, not every day. I've got to be doing it regularly. And I think just thinking about prayer in the same way, or reading the Bible, or like one of your excellent guests in the past pointed out, fasting, or any of these things as a kind of routine. It's this thing that's this self-improvement. We're doing, in some sense, you're competing with your past self. I think this is a message that men don't get about the Christian life, and you see it, often the saints that I cover are, they're in a private competition with themselves to try to push their own ascetic or spiritual boundaries in some way, and um, so I guess that would be my my suggestion.
Yeah. No, that's a great one. Work until every breath you take, you say thy will be done.
Yeah.
And only compare yourself to yourself.
That's right.
that would be a good competition.
Yeah.
So no. Well, Hugh, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the Manly Saints project. I hope that continues to grow, and I'll pray for that as well.
Thank you. Can I plug an upcoming thing?
Yeah.
Or actually,
yeah.
Just it must be done. I think there is in fact a Manly Saints book coming out. I'm just finishing talking to a publisher, so if you like the Manly Saints, it should soon be available in a book. And for anyone who's interested in traditionalist Catholic audio and written content, some friends of mine and I will very shortly be launching a sort of traditional historical audio magazine, and it'll. I don't want to say too much about it, but all the details will be on. You'll be able to find them all on my Substack, and I will promote it relentlessly, starting today.
Perfect.
So, thanks for giving me.
No, that's great, and I'll. Of course, and I'll put a link to your Substack in the description below. I look forward to that. I think obviously there's a little bit of observation bias because I'm now one of these people that's trying to make a little project and put it out on the internet. But it is super heartening to see how much is happening right now. There seems to be a lot of, again, bias, but a lot of men that are, coming out with books or making Substacks or making podcasts. And that's very inspiring to know that there is this. It's taken us a while.
Yeah, no.
but we are trying to reverse those 800 years of Leon Poodle's observations. So
absolutely no. There's so much. There's so many niches. So I think if anybody's wondering, is the time right to make this a kind of apostolate or whatever? The time is right. There are many things you could be doing.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for hopping on.
Thanks.
And thank you for the conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for watching The Making of Man. If you liked that episode, please click here for more, and remember to like and subscribe.